Hope you can hear me okay. Great, thank you everyone. It's great to be here and to be part of this conversation on the importance of girls' education and why we are focusing on it. So my name is Pauline Rose and I'm at the University of Cambridge, where I direct the Research for Equitable Access and Learning, the REAL Centre, and we work in countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia primarily, working with a number of different partners in universities, non-governmental organisations, together with governments on issues around girls' education, as well as other issues around intersecting disadvantage. So I'm here, I've been tasked with sort of defining the problem, and perhaps I'll also touch on a couple of potential more positive aspects after defining the problem. And I can see I've got some wonderful speakers after me who are going to also be making some really important points contributing to this discussion. I'm going to see whether I can share my screen. Let me see, it's the right one. Okay. Is it gone? It's not showing, is it? Is it showing anything?
Yes, you're fine. Thank you, Pauline. You're perfect.
Okay, so I'm seeing something different. So I hope you can see the full PowerPoint.
Girls' education defining the problem in beautiful red green. Yes, we can see.
Okay, excellent. So I'm just going to start by reminding us of what the commitments are, and there's good reasons why these commitments are in place. So in 2021, the group of 7 countries recommitted, I guess, to the Sustainable Development Goals that have a collective belief that 12 years of safe and quality education for all children, and specifically girls, is one of the most cost-effective and impactful social and economic investments governments and donors can make. And they further went on to say, at the forefront of our efforts will be the most marginalised and vulnerable girls, most at risk of being left behind, whether on account of poverty, disability, or the effects of conflict, displacement and natural disasters. And this intersection of different factors of disadvantage are really vital for understanding what the problem is, the extent of the problem, and therefore also identifying solutions. Now, the first part of this commitment could be seen as rather instrumental as to, should we be only focusing on girls because this is a cost-effective intervention? It obviously is important to also think about it in terms of the transformational aspects that girls' education has for the girls themselves and for their families. So I think the sort of way into this, when one's talking with politicians, with ministers of finance, etc., is to make these sorts of statements as to why there are broader benefits, but we mustn't lose sight of the main reasons of why it's important for the girls themselves. And just to say, this commitment has been recently, there's been a sort of recent study that has looked at the baseline of where we are currently in relation to the commitments that were made by this G7 in relation to this declaration. Now, I imagine we're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, and girls' education obviously cuts across the 2 Sustainable Development Goals 4 and 5 in particular. So the one on ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Now, this goal, across all of the targets in this goal, there is a commitment globally to track progress by girls and boys, so to actually identify the extent to which there are narrowing of gaps between girls and boys. And at the same time, there is the Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is specifically focused on achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. So that goes back to what I was saying about, obviously there's this interconnection between girls' education and empowerment, and these two go in 2 directions, that one is going to be reinforcing the other. Now, we know, and on this slide here, we know that COVID had a number of negative effects on the Sustainable Development Goals overall, as well as in relation to education specifically. And there's quite a lot of evidence that this has potentially had adverse effects on widening the gender gaps further in some contexts. And this was sometimes because when schools closed, girls had less access to remote learning, they had less access to technology and so on, and quite a few studies that have shown this, particularly in low and low middle income countries. So any of the progress that we had been making has potentially been maybe not wiped out totally, hopefully, but has been negatively affected and requires even more strident monitoring and interventions to tackle the problem. So this is actually work that we did with Antara, who I think is speaking next, so with the UN Girls Education Initiative. We were in response to sort of looking at some of the issues that the report on the G7 was coming up with that I mentioned earlier. There was quite a lot of good news in terms of gender gaps narrowing in terms of access and to some extent learning across countries. So in numerical terms, in many countries now girls are in school, maybe at least as many as boys, and in some countries there may be more girls in school than boys. And in some countries they're also their learning outcomes are at least as strong as boys, but and sometimes they're doing better than boys. However, this does not mean that we have tackled the factors that affect gender equality. There are a number of barriers that girls face more specifically than boys, or that girls face to a greater extent than boys. So I won't go through all the examples that are on here, but just to give a couple, highlight a couple of ones, we can see down the bottom in the yellow box that girls often spend many more hours a day in unpaid care and domestic work than boys of the same age, and this gap increases with age. This often means that girls either don't have the opportunity to study at home, to continue with their education outside of the school environment, and it can often mean that that their learning is affected, and perhaps they will also drop out, particularly as they get older and they reach adolescence. On the other hand, the box next to it, where we see that many young people are affected by the fact that their education is not necessarily translating them into effective employment opportunities. Again, this can affect girls more severely, who are often more likely to be in insecure work, low paid work, and facing hazards in terms of their works. So there are real issues for girls in this school to work transition as well. So there are many other issues that are on this slide, but just to say these are some of the reasons why it's important to understand the dynamics that girls face in particular, and the dynamics between girls and boys in relation to their education. So to summarise some of these issues a bit further, and to reiterate the point that I was making, that in numerical terms, which is often referred to as gender parity, we might be seeing improvements, and that's great. We have been seeing improvements in girls and boys getting into school, but this does not equate to gender equality. It does not mean that we've seen the transformation for girls that is needed. So gender parity is often given the most attention when we see these global reports, these reports like the G7. They're sort of making often quite strident claims about, yes, we've made such progress, and maybe even claiming that we've achieved narrowed the gaps in terms of gender. And this is based on these numbers of those in school and learning, but this doesn't show the full picture. So it's really important that we go beyond these literacy and numeracy, which is absolutely vital in its own right. So not to say we should not be looking at that, in as much as many children around the world are still not achieving the basics in literacy and numeracy, but that's not enough. So to give one example, in recent work that we have been doing in Ethiopia on a large scale research programme working with colleagues in Addis Ababa University, in the context of COVID, we were identifying the effects of COVID, both on children's numeracy and literacy, as well as on their socio-emotional learning. So the various factors that affect children's learning beyond these more sort of easy to measure things of numeracy and literacy. So socio-emotional learning might include things like how much girls and boys feel comfortable in engaging with others in their class and in their communities, the number of friends they have, the support that they have from various networks and so on. So this socio-emotional learning, there are various measures of it. And in Ethiopia, from our measures of looking before and after COVID, we found that it was adversely affected in the context of COVID, and that girls were affected more than boys. So this is something that's really important to understand, is the sort of environment in which girls and boys are learning, so not just the outcomes that they're achieving. The next point, and I think Susanna Hares is going to be picking up on this point in particular, so she'll be able to elaborate in a much better than I can, but I think this is absolutely vital to think about the gender-based violence aspects and how this affects girls and boys differently. So it's not to say that boys don't experience gender-based violence, they absolutely do, but the types of violence can be different for girls and boys. Girls are often found to be more at risk of sexual assault, boys are more at risk of corporal punishment, and the fears of gender-based violence can often mean that parents are more likely to pull their girls out of school than their boys. There's some evidence around this, but as I said, I think Susanna will be elaborating further on some of these issues. So following on from that, there's also a lot of evidence to highlight the ways in which and extent to which girls are more likely to get married earlier, especially at times of crisis. And this has again been identified in times of COVID, that girls have been married at an earlier age, and these girls are very unlikely to go back to school, and also that they might experience early pregnancies, which also prevent them from going back to school. Sometimes schools themselves won't allow girls to go back, but even where they in principle do allow them to go back, it's very difficult for various reasons for the girls to re-enter. Within the school environment, there are often gender stereotypes that affect girls' trajectories and how girls see themselves. So we know that in curriculum and textbooks, girls are often portrayed in certain job roles and leadership spaces, and others that aren't seen as relevant for women. So we often see the girls and women in the more traditional roles and not in roles that might be better paid jobs, in more higher level leadership positions and so on. And this reinforces the view for these girls in school as to what the opportunities potentially are for them later on. I've already mentioned the fact that child work affects all children, but is gendered, with girls often particularly affected by domestic work and long hours of work, and the fact that young women are more likely to face discrimination in the labour market, in particular in terms of pay, in terms of the job safety and so on, and the risk an extreme at the risk of sex work and exploitation. So these are all factors that have effects on both girls and boys in some cases, but more likely often to have a more extreme effect on girls, and particularly the most marginalised girls. So a question that often comes up is, and increasingly so, is what about the boys? So the blog that I mentioned earlier that we did together with Antara and colleagues at UNGAI was a reaction to a discussion that was happening and a report that came out that suggested, or we interpreted as suggesting, that we've forgotten about the boys, and some of the funders and donors were saying, oh, we've read this report, we now need to switch our money from focusing on girls to focusing on boys. And we were saying, hang on a minute, yes, boys do need attention, but actually there's still a lot to be done in terms of supporting girls' education for all the reasons I've mentioned. So absolutely, it's the case that marginalised boys can also be denied access to quality education, and this needs attention. But as I've been saying, the systematic disadvantages faced by marginalised girls and then women mean that we still need to use this campaign for girls' education as an entry point. So rather than seeing a focus on girls' education as being something that isn't beneficial to boys, seeing it as an entry point for both actually benefiting girls as well as benefiting boys at the same time, and working together across girls and boys in terms of achieving this change. And sort of the bottom line being that improving gender equality in education systems will improve multiple aspects of development for all. It's not just the girls who will benefit, both in terms of their schooling as well as beyond. So it's not all bad news, and we've been working just give a couple of examples. We've been working very closely with a non-governmental organisation called CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education, who have been working for quite a number of years in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. They've been working particularly in poor rural communities within the countries in which they work, and supporting girls who otherwise would not have been able to get into secondary school in order to get into government secondary schools in those countries. Now, one thing to say about the work, we've done some analysis of the data that CAMFED has that has shown very clearly that the CAMFED programme has had a huge impact on both the retention of these marginalised girls in school, so they have stayed in school when they would normally be have been expected to drop out, and when you compare to other very similar schools, these girls have dropped out of those other schools to a greater degree. And these girls have also been learning better than those schools that haven't had the support. But I think importantly also is that there have been found to be spillover effects to boys. So it's not that it's only been girls that have benefited by any means, both because of the design of the interventions and because of more generally the improvement in the school environment overall. It's both boys and girls who have benefited through having a targeted approach on girls' education, as well as improving the quality of education more generally. So one of the aspects of the CAMFED programme is something called learner guides. And I think this is something, it's been quite an innovative programme, and I think other sort of examples of this happening elsewhere increasingly as well, where some of these marginalised girls who otherwise would not have been in school have now become what are called learner guides to support girls who are now just starting their secondary school trajectory, and they provide them support in those schools. So they provide mentorship, they provide life skills training and so on. And these learner guides have some form of support that's also given to them and some training. So again, there's been some evaluation of the learner guide model that has been identified as being very effective. So we're working with CAMFED at the moment to say, OK, you know, this is an NGO programme supporting government schools, but how can we make sure this is both scaled up and within the country, in Tanzania, for example, where it's been working, as well as replicated in other countries. So, for example, in Zimbabwe and Zambia, where CAMFED has also been working on other related projects. So we're working with CAMFED and the governments in these countries to identify what are the features of the programme that the government sees as beneficial, that they see as they could take on in the absence of CAMFED, that they think are going to really make a difference to the quality of education, including for these marginalised girls. So this is, again, a sort of very positive experience of sort of seeing how we can not just that we can actually reach far larger numbers. As a follow-up to this, we're just starting some work with CAMFED that we're also very excited about, to look at not just how this learner guide model is changing the experience of girls within school, but also how it is shifting gender social norms within the communities in which CAMFED has been supporting the school. So how can we make sure that this learner guide model both shifts the balance of power in schools, but also in communities, so that there's a more systemic societal change that hopefully will be a virtuous circle in going forward. So this is what we're about to be starting to look into in order to see what unlocks, complements and grows the girls' capacities as agents of change and helps to elevate their status, and also see how they play different roles within the communities from what they might have previously been playing. So hopefully we can provide further information on that as that work progresses. And finally, other work that we've been doing, part of an independent evaluation team looking at a very large scale programme of work that's been going on for over 10 years now, called the Girls' Education Challenge. This is in a number of very low and low middle income countries, including in fragile and conflict states, that has tried to reach the most marginalised girls through a variety of interventions and programmes. And the slide that I've got here is showing a recent report that we have written on teachers and teaching for marginalised girls, which looked at the extent to which these programmes were able to support children and girls in particular during school closures. And one of the important things that highlighted was the important role of female teachers in supporting the girls during this disruption. So it was the female teachers who would often go to the homes to visit the girls and provide additional support of various kinds. At the same time, we then sort of highlighted that these teachers, and female teachers in particular, had to take on a range of different and new roles in the context of COVID. But obviously that requires them to have support which they needed, that perhaps wasn't as forthcoming as it needs to be more generally. So there are a number of important lessons, and there's a lot of documentation on the Girls Education Challenge website that can give a lot more insights into the various projects and programmes that have been reaching marginalised girls through a wide range of innovations and interventions. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that has given you an initial flavour, and will hopefully be complementary to the presentations that we're going to shortly be hearing. So thank you very much.
Pauline, thank you. I do have a question before you leave us. How can we measure the development of social and emotional skills? And if changes are made, how can we then measure the progress that we're making?
So that's a really good question, and actually it's something that we've been working on. We had some funding from the Lego Foundation during the school closures due to COVID to look at this, and I know a number of other organisations are also looking at it. So there are some scales that have been developed to quantify socio-emotional skills. Obviously, it needs to be made. Made sure that it's contextually specific and appropriate. So we looked at scales that have been used in different related low-income contexts, and we worked with colleagues within Ethiopia, colleagues in Ethiopia, to sort of identify what questions made sense, which ones didn't make sense, and then piloted them. And so we do have some documentation that identifies those approaches that we used that could be looked at in other contexts as well. So there are definitely some measures that are out there. I think one of the things that we found challenging about doing it as girls become more self-confident, they might become more self-confident in the way they answer some of the questions on these scales. So you might actually see that there's a decline in socio-emotional learning when actually that's because of the way that they're answering. So there's a lot of also thinking about how to make sure we can use these sorts of data in appropriate ways. It's definitely more challenging than measuring basic literacy and numeracy, and that's no doubt why it doesn't get so much attention, one of the reasons. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And as you can see, it's a work in progress. Thank you, especially for reminding us that all the news is not bad. Yes, there are disparities. Yes, there are gaps that we definitely need to bridge, but there's some really good news out there. Thank you very much again.